Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination, but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. The nights are long, the days are short, and the weather is chilly to downright cold, depending on where you are. It's a good time to slip into a Quince iconic Mongolian cashmere sweaters, which start at only $50. You can treat yourself to everyday luxury at an affordable price with Quince. If you really want to dive into luxury, you can check out their leather handbags, washable silk shirts, and European linen sheet sets. Whatever you're looking for at Quince, all the prices are 50 to 80% less than similar brands, and they do that by partnering directly with top factories and cutting out the middleman. They only work with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing processes. And of course, they use premium fabrics and finishes for that luxury feel in every piece. But you've already heard me rave about my Quince travel pants. Treat yourself this winter without the luxury price tag. Go to quince.com/traveler for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/traveler to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/traveler. And thanks to Quince for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. Amateur Traveler, episode 121. Today, the Amateur Traveler goes to the national parks in the United States. Some of them are big, some of them are small, and a few of them are even completely underwater. Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. Last week I promised you that I would find you some better travel news this week. The first story I have for you is about airlines going greener. Virgin Airline is doing a test flight of a Boeing 747 running on a mixture of diesel and biofuel. Branson actually has an alternatives fuel division at Virgin, which makes me wonder what he hasn't invested in. And it was created in 2006 from the profits of his airlines and trains. They started a similar test 6 months ago with a biofueled passenger train. It does make me wonder if the planes, like so many biofueled cars, will end up smelling like French fries. And then, speaking of cool new things, Disneyland is getting new monorails. I've got a picture in the article at Tripinator.com. The first in the line will feature blue glass and red stripes that change color in sunlight, sort of like a big mood ring. I'd like to welcome to the show Eric Smith. Eric has come to talk to us about a particular goal in domestic travel in the United States. Welcome to the show, Eric.
Thanks, Chris.
I'm going to let you say what it is that your goal is here.
Well, my goal basically is to visit the national park units of the lower 48 states. I hope eventually to get to Alaska and Hawaii, but for now, just concentrating on the 300-plus park units in the lower 48 has proved quite a task to get through.
Just a little pause here and do that again. There are over 300 national parks because they come in all sizes. So how many have you been to so far?
Roughly 66%. On my current quest, I only count the parks that I visited as an adult. My family did a lot of traveling when I was a teen, and I don't count the parks that I visited then, mostly because I like to lay them out in a photo essay style, and the parks that I visited when I was a teen were all photographed in the 70s and the 80s when photography wasn't as nice and clear as it is with digital. Basically, this current quest started in 1999 and has been going on since then.
And to just give some people a range of the kind of places that you've been to, what's the smallest park you've been to and what's the largest?
I've been to a lot of the big ones, like Yellowstone, for example, and Glacier National Park is also a very large park. I've also been to some of the small parks, which are smaller than city blocks. So some of the presidential homes, like the Taft House outside of Cincinnati, is just one lot, and it's just a home. Their smallest national park I haven't been to yet, which is the Benjamin Franklin Memorial in Philadelphia area. I haven't been to that one yet, but some of them are as small as a city block.
Okay. And your favorite? Let's start with the most obvious question.
Well, and it's a pretty obvious answer. It's Yellowstone. I just think that it's so singular in the earth to find a place as varied as Yellowstone. You have mountains, you have the unique geothermal features that they have there. It's a wonderful place for families to visit. If you visit early in the season, you're more apt to find the wildlife, but anytime you go, you'll find buffalo just meandering across the road, which, coming from the east like I am, we don't have buffalo, and it's just amazing to see them so up close. I mean, I don't know how many times I've been in Yellowstone and have been delayed trying to get to a hike or to a visitor center by a buffalo jam. And it's a wonderful thing to see. I've seen bears there. When I was there in May a couple years ago, I was able to see a grizzly at a safe distance across the river. But it's always a thrill to see wildlife that's not natural to your home state.
You mentioned the geothermal activities. Obviously, everyone knows about Old Faithful, which is a relatively consistent geyser. Of the geothermal volcanic sort of features, what do you think that people ought to make sure that they don't miss out on?
The geothermal features are great. The best one that I think I visited was called the Norris Geyser Basin, and that is north of Old Faithful. And the thing I like most about the geothermal features is the absolute rancid sulfur smell that they give off. And it's a great place to take kids, because kids just cannot believe that that smell is sometimes attached to these very beautiful formations and features.
Okay. Favorite of the small parks?
Well, I'll tell you, I recently visited the forts in Kansas, which are Fort Larned and Fort Scott, and I don't know if there's somebody in Congress who's been setting aside more money for the Kansas national parks than for some of the other parks that I visited, but they were all very well done, very nicely restored, and signposted great, and just more thorough. A lot of the forts you visited will have a reproduction of the fort, but these forts had a lot of money obviously put into them, and that always makes for better displays.
And these were the frontier forts, I assume?
Right, yes. They were the frontier forts. Fort Larned is in western Kansas, and Fort Scott is right about on the Missouri border. So Fort Scott, you can tell, has less of the plains feel that dances with Wolfseal, where when you're at Fort Larned, that's what you get from that. It's a much more plains-type feel, and it's much more spread out. Where Fort Scott is actually right in downtown Fort Scott, Kansas, which is interesting to see the old fort with the new modern city.
Why did you start trying to visit all the national parks? How did you get started with that? And did you know there were over 300 when you decided to do that?
Well, yeah, when I first looked at the list, I thought, boy, this is something that's just crazy to even think about. And what I did, I've done trips before, and what I like to do is visit a lot of places. When I go on a trip, I like to visit a lot of places, and then with the assumption that someday the places I really, really like, I will go back to.
Okay.
Well, it doesn't always work that way. When I started this particular quest, what I had basically done is I had said, well, I want to visit the Grand Canyon and some of the parks around the Grand Canyon. And when I looked at the map with all the national parks on it, I thought I could kind of make a connect the dots thing. So I made a little circle and took one route down and one route back to Michigan and just connected the dots there. And it was you were simply able to just do parks like that. And that's what I try to tell people is National Park Service has on their website a great map with all the parks plotted geographically on there. If you're going to go, you plot where your home is, you look for a route that takes you through a bunch of parks getting to the one you want to get to, and then you can do a bunch of parks on the way back. I discourage people from doing the same route there and back because you always see different scenery on routes, plus the way the parks are laid out geographically, you can just connect the dots and take two separate routes.
Okay. And obviously, no matter where you are in the U.S., there's a national park near you. There may be some exception to that I don't know.
There's one state that doesn't have a national park. If you want to start with the guessing by the smallest state, Delaware, you'd be right. So, or the second smallest state. Yeah, Delaware does not have a national park unit. So
interesting.
But it's the only one.
So you've been to 66% of them so far. What was the one that was the most surprising? Like, I can't believe this is a national park. Who was it who decided that this should be one?
I get a lot of that. I walk into a national park and I think, what defines a national park? How did they come up with this particular idea? And I've been to so many. I guess one of the ones that it really caught me by surprise was the Jimmy Carter National Historic Site in Georgia.
Okay.
And Jimmy Carter is such a recent president that I'm only in my 30s, and yet I remember him very well. But what it basically is the national park has made sort of a zone around the city, and they have preserved his high school. They preserved the Carter farm outside of Plains, Georgia. And it's fascinating to see the gas station where his brother used to own is there. The rail car, which was his campaign headquarters, is there. But it's not your typical national park where you go and you see all this beautiful scenery sites. It's very cultural, but it's not your national park, which has specific boundaries. It's just certain things preserved inside of a larger boundary. And it was fascinating because you just wouldn't anticipate this. The visitor center itself was located in the high school, which he attended right there in Plains, which gave you a great look into life in the 1920s and 30s.
Okay. Top 3 most beautiful national parks you've seen?
Well, I'm a big fan of mountains myself.
Okay.
I love Yellowstone. I said the beauty there is amazing. But if I have to pick 3 others, I'm a big fan of Glacier National Park.
Okay. The Going to Sun Highway.
Yeah, going to the Sun Highway is amazing. And I visited there in September and I visited there in May. And the time I visited in May, unfortunately, Going to the Sun was still closed. That's one of the things about certain national parks you have to keep in mind is that you have to do your research in advance and make sure that the park is not open seasonally or is not closed certain days of the week. Some parks do that, and that's just part of it. But the beauty of Glacier is the Going to the Sun Road, and you drive through these massive glacier-carved valleys, which you look down and you look at the trees, and they just look like little toy trees placed on a miniature model. It's absolutely fabulous. I'm also a very big fan of Crater Lake National Park.
Okay, sure.
I know people who visited there and have had rainy days or have had overcast days, but I had a nice, beautiful, sunny day, and the color of the lake itself is not a color that can be described by any of your normal color words. It's such a strange color blue. It's a color you don't see in most lakes or oceans. It's just absolutely fabulous. And they have such a great drive around that you get so many different vantage points of the park itself.
Yeah, if you only had the 24 crayon box, you probably don't have a word for that. I'd agree with that.
Yeah, it's so different from the blues that you see everywhere else. Again, I've seen what Banff and Jasper National Parks have as far as the turquoise blue, but it's not that kind of blue. It's a very different color blue. And I've been told by people who have visited and by some of the park rangers there that the color changes depending on the day that you have. So that also would make it very interesting. If you could spend multiple days there, I'm sure you'd get many different looks at what kind of park that actually is. As far as other beautiful parks, if you like desert, there are lots of beautiful parks. I particularly like Arches National Park as far as beauty goes. It is a nice slice of desert, but it's also a part mountainous park, and the formations themselves are outstanding.
Let's put these all in states. So Glacier we've got is in Montana, Crater Lake is in Oregon, and Arches is in Utah.
Yep. It's in western Utah. Eastern Utah, right. Arches is in a good place because you can also go to a bunch of national parks. The Four Corners area itself has a lot of really great national parks. One of my favorite national parks is Mesa Verde, which is right down there in southwestern Colorado. And it is a look into a life that none of us can hardly even imagine with these large Anasazi Pueblo buildings built right into the sides of cliff faces in most cases, and you can take great ranger-led tours that'll take you right down into them. They look like apartment complexes just built, mini cities built right into the side of the mountains, and they show you how they got their water by running through the limestone. And it's one of the national parks that, because it's so remote and so far from big cities, it's probably less visited than would be a Grand Canyon or a Great Smoky Mountains, but still is one that just can't be missed. And in that area, as well as Hovenweep National Monument, which is right across the border into eastern Utah, and it shows you a different part of the Indian life, where these dwellings are not inside cliff faces. These are set out on a plain in the middle of a desert. So it's two very different styles of building and a very different lifestyle period, but they're both within a 40-mile range, and that's something that's always good to be able to get a different look at that in such a close area.
You mentioned ranger-guided hike. One of the highlights for me of a lot of the national parks are some of the wonderful park rangers that have helped guide me around or show things. Best ranger experience?
Okay, best ranger experience. Well,
or top 3 if best is hard.
I've had so many good ones, and these are very dedicated people who don't make a lot of money, and they put so much of their heart and soul into the parks, and many of them have worked at different parks. What I enjoy is I always like listening to them talk about the park they currently work at, but I also like listening to them talk about parks that they've been to. I just mentioned Mesa Verde, and the ranger who guided our tour there was a Native American himself, and he had insights into the park that I don't think you would get in a lot of other parks. He was absolutely amazing and very passionate about what he did, as I said, a lot of them are.
Oh, yeah.
I visited a park which is 70 miles west of Key West, in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico. It's called Dry Tortugas. It's a Civil War era fort that was built on one of these coral keys on these small islands, and it's an amazing park. The rangers there are cut off from really a lot of modern life, and they are very passionate about what they do, and they led a tour around this fort that just, as you take the boat out there, it just appears all of a sudden in the middle of this wide ocean, and they were very passionate about the tour as well. And I've been to a lot of forts, and it's hard with some of the condition that some of these forts are in to imagine what life was like there. But the ranger out there in particular was wonderful at explaining how everyday life, and the more he explained, the more you thought, boy, these soldiers must have felt like they were just in the middle of nowhere, just cut off from absolutely anywhere. Now they have modern technology, and they have telephones, and I'm sure they even have an internet connection on the island. But back in the Civil War times, they had absolutely no connection to the outside world at all, and they just waited for something to happen. And he made that very clear to all of us. He took us up top and showed us the wide expanse of sea and said, just look out, there's nothing here. And you wait for days and days and days and months and years on end just to get any mention from the outside world, and that was absolutely amazing. I tell you, the rangers at Civil War battlefields can be tough for people to imagine, even Gettysburg, which is amazing to see and has a very good guided audio tour. But if you can get with a ranger, a lot of times the Civil War battlefields will mix in modern technology. You'll see a Burger King sign in the distance, and that cuts down on your ability to imagine what the battlefield is really like. But if you can find a ranger experience at one of those parks, that will also enhance your enjoyment of the park. And to mention, the National Park website does a great job of posting when those programs are. All you need to do is go on to nps.gov, and you can find usually a link to the park's individual page on their site, and they will have usually in an Adobe file the list of their programs. And those are one of the things that you should do well in advance, because you don't want to miss those. They just increase your enjoyment of the park so much.
Absolutely. We mentioned national parks, and then you mentioned at one point National Historic Monument. When we talk about national parks, they break down into a couple different varieties. Did you want to enumerate those for us?
Well, I can tell you what they are. I've looked into the different definitions of the parks, the different titles the parks take, and I can't find a universal way that the parks are
categorized.
Yeah, I believe it probably has something to do with the amount of money the parks get. But first of all are your big national parks, and they usually save those for the phenomenal ones. And the national parks are the famous ones: Grand Canyon, Glacier, Shenandoah, Olympic, Zion, and Bryce, which you've covered in a previous podcast. And they're national parks for good reason. Those are the most visited, and it's always for good reason. If it's got national park on it, it probably is a place you want to be. The smaller parks break down in a lot of different ways. There are national historic sites, which obviously relate to a history story in some way, a part of American history. But there's also a national historic park, which, best I can tell, those break down into multiple historical times. For example, Harper's Ferry National Historic Park in West Virginia. The history of Harper's Ferry is not only the
John Brown raid.
John Brown, right, but it's also the story of early America and how small towns grew up. And so they would encompass a lot in that. There are national battlefields, there are national battlefield parks, there's national memorials and national monuments. And then there are national recreation areas, which are run sometimes by the Bureau of Land Management, sometimes by the National Park Service, and sometimes the park services will split that. Those tend to be more like lakes and areas where you would go to water ski or specifically hike. A lot of times they lack a specific site that you're going to see.
But not always. We had mentioned, for instance, when we did the show on Boston, the Boston Harbor Islands, for instance, are, as I recall, a national recreation area.
Right, yes, and I should mention that I'm hoping my next trip's going to be to Boston, and with national recreation areas, I often cut them. If all they are is a lake for recreational use, I will often cut them from my list if they lack a specific site to see. And I had done that with Boston Harbor Islands, but once I listened to your podcast, I needed to go and re-add it now that I know I've got a lighthouse to go and see. So, but you can do your research into those things online, and I always check them out real good. And again, a lot of those are just fabulously beautiful areas, and I've been to some, and a lot of those national recreation areas will be adjacent to a national park. Those are great places to camp. The Bureau of Land Management has lots of extremely inexpensive and very beautiful campgrounds in areas that you just would not imagine that you would ever camp in. So I should also mention there's national seashores and lake shores, and those preserve a specific area of water and land. Sleeping Bear Dunes, which is in Michigan where I'm from, is a really great example of inland, not sea-type dunes, but inland lake-type dunes right on the coast of Lake Michigan, just west of Traverse City, Michigan, and is another really interesting park with these enormous dunes, which is also a great park for kids because they can climb up the dunes, and by the time they come down, they will sleep very well at night, and parents love that.
Complete this sentence, if you will. We're going to do this a little bit regionally now. If I'm going to New York City, I should also remember to go to what national park?
Well, Ellis Island's actually a national, part of the National Park Service.
Good
and
choice.
So is the Statue of Liberty. And I did listen to one of your New York podcasts where the person said, if you're going to do one or the other, do Ellis Island. I would agree with that. Do Ellis Island if you're going to do one or the other. I did the Statue of Liberty before September 11th, so it was still open at the time, and it was fascinating, but Ellis Island is so integral to the American history that it's touching and it's extremely historic, and it's definitely one of those places you want to be. New York has a lot of unique national park sites, but Ellis Island's probably the one you would want to go to.
Okay. I'm going to Orlando. What national park should I go to while I'm in that area?
Okay, well, the Florida national parks Florida is a much bigger state than people sometimes, I think, really understand. So a lot of times with the Florida national parks, if you're going to Orlando, up near Jacksonville, which is north of Orlando, is Fort Caroline National Memorial, and I believe it's pronounced Timucuan National and Ecological Preserve. And what that is Fort Caroline is the reproduction of a fort, and Timucuan protects a specific area of an estuary of the river that's up there. And it's also a very popular birding spot, and it's one that you don't want to miss. I've heard that there are manatees up there, although the manatees tend most of the year, when the water up there is cool, to tend to be further south. But it's a good place for wildlife watching.
Okay. If you go to Southern California, you're going down to Disneyland, what national park should you go to while you're there?
I should preface this by saying that on my current quest, one of the places that I definitely need to go back to is California.
Okay.
Most of the parks of California I haven't been to. The park that is right outside
we do have some of the best, I'd have to say. But
yeah, I know. And the drive from Michigan through the plains
is a little longer, yeah. I've done that drive.
It could take a little while. People seem to like Channel Islands National Park a lot.
Okay.
I believe there are tours to 3 or 4 of the separate islands, and they're very popular. They all leave from Oxnard, which is about an hour and a half north, but with Los Angeles traffic, you never know how far north.
Right,
but it's just north of Los Angeles, and people really enjoy that a lot. If I can give you a suggestion here, if you're visiting the Four Corners area, I've made the suggestion of Mesa Verde, but you can literally spend your whole time in the Four Corners area just visiting Indian ruins. And if you're going to do one, do Mesa Verde, but there's Canyon de Chelly there, and just south of the Grand Canyon is Montezuma's Castle, which is not actually what didn't
has nothing to do with Montezuma, yeah.
Right, yeah. People often wonder about that. It's also one that you can't actually walk through. It's a couple of buildings that are up on a cliff face, but they also have, as part of that national monument, what's called Montezuma's Well, which is where the Native Americans at the time would walk to get their water. And that's one thing I should mention about national parks. When you plan a trip to them, you need to be aware that many national parks often have multiple units within the same park. And it's real easy to go to the one that has the visitor center, but a lot of times you'll find gems in other areas. For example, Jean Lafitte National Park is
in New Orleans.
The headquarters are in New Orleans.
Okay.
But there are 6 units of this park which preserve different parts of the Southern Louisiana lifestyle, the Acadian lifestyle. They have different visitor centers in cities, and you could spend a week alone just visiting all the separate units, but it's good to do your research in advance and find out which of those units you like. The New Orleans one preserves certain parts of the French Quarter, and most of those sites were undamaged by Katrina, so that makes a good starting point. But some of it preserves the bayou to the south, which that part of the park was heavily damaged during Katrina, and I'm not sure that they've rebuilt all the boardwalks through the bayou yet, but it was a fascinating look into that part of southern Louisiana. But you just don't want to miss the other units of the park. And the visitor centers will usually have a brochure that you can look at, and will spell out in a very easy map form how to get to them. For example, Fredericksburg in Spotsylvania, I believe it's a national military park right outside of D.C., has 6 or 7 different sites. And you'll want to look at the brochure and find out which of those sites are most appealing to you. And then that's, again, when you go back to your rangers and ask, this is what I'm specifically interested, what part of this park would be good for me to visit.
Well, and the one that I know of that's most geographically diverse in the sense that it's got 2 different headquarters is I think it's a National Historic Park for the Alaskan Gold Rush.
Klondike Gold Rush, yes. It's in Seattle, and it's up in Alaska as well.
Yes, so sometimes you won't get to both parts in the same trip.
Actually, there is one that's more diverse.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, there is a unit of the National Parks Service in Massachusetts called New Bedford Whaling National Park.
Okay.
And I believe that they have a either museum or visitor center in Nome, Alaska as well. And that's pretty far apart. It's not your standard national park unit, but it's something that is associated with the National Park Service in northern Alaska because they also, obviously, whaling was important to the Native Americans up there as well, so they've included that as part of the park, and I'm pretty sure that the 2 of those are tied. I'm going to sing the praises of the National Park Service website. It's not the greatest website you've ever used, and there's certainly a lot more they could do with it. I'm a big fan of the National Park Service because I believe that they do more with less funds than a lot of our government organizations, which are real good at wasting stuff away. But the National Park Service seems to always make the most of its money, and they're lucky that they have people who are as dedicated as a lot of the rangers and a lot of the park administrators do a very good job at making sure that they use everything that they can.
The other question I had for you is it going to be a barrier at all that some of the national parks in the U.S. are underwater for you?
Yeah, I mentioned Dry Tortugas National Park, which is right off the coast of Key West there. And a lot of the highlight, besides the fort, which I'm more into the historical side, but one of the things that was included in our tour out there was the ability to snorkel. And I, like you, have facial hair, and getting it to stay on where you're not drowning. My experience on the Great Barrier Reef was fabulous, but I spent most of my time simply trying not to drown on the warm seawater there. So snorkeling's not my big thing, but there are a lot of the parks. I'm saved by that in the fact that those parks I've also excluded from my current quest because I believe a lot of the underwater parks are in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands.
And Virgin Islands is one I've been to, yeah.
Right, yeah. And I'm going to exclude those ones too in the park in Guam as well. I'm going to leave those off the list until I someday have the money to go back and do those.
The other question I should ask is, for keeping score, do you carry around the National Park Passport?
The one that you stamp,
right.
I do not. I'm a collector of the brochures. I'm a big fan of the color brochures that every national park has. And I like to collect them, and I like to stamp those. But I didn't even really know about the passport until I was probably 100 or so parks into my quest. And then I realized that would have been a really great thing to do, but there was no way I was going back to a lot of the parks just to simply grab a stamp. I've met a lot of people on my trips who do that, and it's one of their prized possessions is their little passport book they carry around with them. And I've met people who've been to more parks than I have. It's a really clever idea the National Park Service came up with, and it increases the knowledge and people's desire to visit a lot of the really obscure national parks. People will head to places they would never have thought about going because there's a city block worth of national park unit there that they want to see, and I think that that's great. Well, there are good sites online for people who collect those. I put pictures up on my website, and I've seen people who don't put pictures up, they just put their stamp up. So it's obviously a great idea and just increases people's desire to visit the national parks.
And that's what I found is that once we got that, and we got actually through a friend we traveled with, I think we got it at Haleakala National Park, because we learned from the rangers that the line of the last A means it's a long A. Then when we went to the Big Island, for instance, we went to all 4 national parks in the Big Island, and I'm sure that we wouldn't have gone to 3 of them because they are relatively small parks. But because you have that, you know of it, and it gives you just a little more incentive. And we enjoyed all 3. Certainly, in terms of the best name for national park, we talked about this a little bit before we started recording. The Pu'uho'ohonauanau National Park in Hawaii is my favorite. But
I'm so impressed with your Hawaiian. I wouldn't even begin.
You'll notice that this time I said it, but before we started recording, I couldn't get it out. But
I tell people a lot of times that that's the reason I'm not visiting the Hawaii national parks, is because I simply couldn't pronounce the names and just am not willing to look like a fool. You're right. The thing you said about the national parks, some of the smaller ones are gems. There's a park in California, and I'm sure since it's just on the other side of the mountains from you, you've probably visited Manzanar National Historic Site.
I have not been to Manzanar.
I
want to get there.
Fabulous. I visited it a couple years ago. It was an internment camp for Japanese Americans during World War II. The site itself has not been restored very much. This is one of the newer national park sites. I believe it was designated during the Reagan administration, but the weekend I just happened to go there was one of the very first weekends the visitor center was open, and this is one of the GEMS visitor centers. The visitor centers are usually very good. The film strips inside of them are of varying quality, but the visitor centers themselves are very good. This was one of the best I've ever seen. It was moving. It was one of those parks where you wouldn't think about visiting there. The fact that the history is not very long ago makes you shake your head. It's admirable that we would be willing to preserve and look at this part of history when it's one of those parts of history that makes you very sad looking at what happened there. And it's in a very unique area. It's just on the other side of the Sierras, so it's in the kind of a windswept valley. It's very hot, and it can also be very cold. It's a good trip if you're going to Death Valley. You can run right over there. And what it is they have a lot of the foundations of the buildings are left, but very little of the buildings themselves are left. And they have the buildings, they have them placard out. You can see where the buildings were and just kind of get an idea. But again, the visitor center there is very moving. And when you walk in, they have a bunch of boards showing quotes from respected journalists at the time, and it makes you very sad to be an American at times, but it makes you understand, hopefully, how far we've come since. And it's a part of American history that we won't be proud of, but it's nice it's preserved so that we can learn, because that's the point of history, is to learn from the lessons of the past.
Well, do you have any other recommendations as we wind this down for people who might be interested, if not in trying to see all the parks, at least in going to the National Park Service and finding the ones in their state?
Well, what I would say is you can avoid the crowds by visiting off-peak. I like to do my traveling in May. I hope I just haven't spoiled it for myself by sending everybody out in May. But I really enjoy traveling in May.
There aren't that many people who listen to the show right now. It's 5,000 to 6,000 right now. So.
Okay. You can get a lot of the sites in May. And again, it's harder for people with children. You can't just pull them out of school in May and take them on a trip. But a lot of parks aren't open in May. A lot of the mountain parks are still under a lot of snow. But if you can go in May, it's a good month to go. September is also proven to be a very good month to go. One of the things I would suggest, and this is more of a lifestyle idea, I like to get to the park early. I know a lot of rangers laugh because when they open the visitor center door at 8 or 9 or whatever they do, I'm there already and ready to go. But if you start your day early, you can beat whatever crowds do pile up. And if you're going to a park where there's wildlife, the earlier the better. And the other thing I would say is, with the internet now, and I've mentioned the National Park Service website a couple times, it's good to check the parks in advance, because some are closed for seasons, some are closed for certain days. I think you've mentioned that you've been to Cedar Breaks National Monument.
I haven't been to Cedar Breaks. I've been to a lot of the other parks in Utah, but not Cedar Breaks.
Well, Cedar Breaks is very, very difficult to visit because it opens up a lot of times at the beginning of June, and it's often closed by snow by the beginning of September. So that's one example of a park that you would want to look at. Also, a lot of the parks are only accessible on a guided tour. For example, a lot of the presidential homes, a lot of the historic homes that you visit, you can't just go in and walk around the house yourself. You have to know when the tour times start. A lot of places will allow you to buy tickets in advance. You need to know those things. And some parks also have limitations. For example, Fort Bowie in Arizona, you park a mile and a half away from the site itself. It's a very pretty walk, but a lot of people would be limited by a mile and a half hike to get to the visitor center itself. And you need to know these things before you show up, because I've met a lot of people who've been disappointed. I met a couple at Fort Bowie who were very disappointed not to be able to show up and just see the fort itself and leave. They were upset of having to walk through the desert in 95-degree heat just to get to the site.
Okay. And then it seems like we should also put in a plug for the American Eagle Park Pass.
They used to have another pass, the Passport, which was cheaper. I believe it was $50 compared to the $80 one. The pass is a great idea if you're going to spend enough to warrant it. Now, what you can do is you can go on the website, again, like I mentioned with the advanced study, you can go on there and find out what the admissions fees for your parks are going to be. Add them up. If it's more than the value of the pass, then buy the pass. If it's not, then you may want to forego it. The pass a lot of times makes a good sense because it's valid for a year, and even if on a specific trip you're not spending enough to warrant buying it, it's still good at all the park units, and you'll never know when you'll be visiting a relative or something and they'll have a park down the street that you want to look at. You'll have your pass. I think you've mentioned in a podcast before that it comes with a nice color booklet which gives you the geographic locations of all the parks, which again is another way of turning you on to parks that you might not have known existed.
Right. Well, Eric, I thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing your obsession with the national parks. I happen to share it. My score is much lower than you, but I was trying to figure out if we could do a quiz for how many national parks we had mentioned in the show, and every time I kept thinking about all the parks that we have already mentioned, I kept thinking of other ones. So I don't know what the number is, but it is something that I've enjoyed because a lot of my childhood, our traveling was to national parks. And so my love for travel basically started in the national parks in the U.S., particularly in the West. But
it is a great place to start with your kids out. And then, again, we've mentioned before how much the National Park Service does with sometimes limited resources, and these people deserve to be commended for it. You could go and travel only to national parks, and it would increase your love for America. Obviously, you can visit a lot of sites on the way as well, but the national parks is a great way to increase your appreciation for this wonderful country we live in.
Yeah, final word about the ranges I really think is a great idea because I think I mentioned on my show this summer when we were at a national park in Europe, and I won't pick on the particular country right now, we ran into park rangers there who were kind of surly and really not very social. And obviously they were speaking a different language than we were, so that was a barrier. But we realized that part of our expectations were the many wonderful people we had run into in America's national parks. So it really did set our expectations very high for this is the way park rangers behave with the public, and this is their love for their job and their love for what they're doing. So my hat's off to them.
They are people of passion.
Yep. Eric, thank you very much for being on the show.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
I'm going to skip the internet resources section of the show for today. For one thing, I didn't have a resource in mind, and two, we have a friend who's visiting today that I would like to go and spend some time with. Coincidentally, the one who first introduced us to the National Park Passport. I heard from Kayleen this week, who said, good morning. On my 4-kilometer walk to work, I listened to the non-iTunes enhanced version of the Amateur Traveler podcast. I have been listening from almost the first episode. Wow. I love listening and love the variety of the places discussed. I like the new version of the theme song. It keeps Amateur Traveler's branding consistent and freshens the start a bit. Thanks for the very entertaining, informative show. Kayleen, thanks. Thanks for your faithful listenership over all of these years. Also heard from Kevin Crossman of the Frat Pack Tribute. Hi, Kevin, who also likes the new version of the opening. I'm going to stick with that for a little while longer, and my apologies for those of you who liked the old version better. I went to the Bay Area Travel Show last week, as I said I was going to, and I ran into Amy. You may remember that Amy was the person who left a voicemail saying that she sometimes walks around the house singing the theme song for the Amateur Traveler. So it was nice meeting Amy. And then I also went to the Divine Adventures booth. Those of you who've been listening to the show for over 2 years may remember Andy Divine, who came on the show and talked about bicycle tours. And I learned that at least one of you has taken advantage of that information and has gone on a tour after hearing about it from the Amateur Traveler, and one told them, which is always very nice, but didn't tell me, so I'd be very curious who it was and how you enjoyed it. When I talked to Eric this week for the interview that you just heard, he did say something else about the show that I wanted to share with you.
The thing your show does better than any of the other travel shows I've listened to is it just what travel is supposed to do is open up your mind, and what your show
Right,
does
that's
is
my
open
goal.
up your mind to possibilities
Yep.
of things that you wouldn't have considered before.
Which obviously I was glad to hear Eric mention, because that is the goal of the show. But he went on to mention a problem that I may have created for some of you.
And I have your podcasts that I won't listen to. There are some on your list that I'm simply not going to do. I'm just not going to do it to myself, because I know it's so far out of my price range or the possibility of what I'm able to do that I'm just not willing to torture myself. I mean, I drive around in my FedEx truck, and I get out of my truck and I've got boxes to deliver, and I'm just dreamy from listening to, places that I've listened to on the podcast. And I just, at times I just think to myself, I can't go all the places I want to go. So stop torturing yourself with descriptions of places that you're just never going to go to.
That's so funny. I haven't heard anybody express it that way before. But so the last thing I wanted to do on this show is apologize to any of you that the show may occasionally get too interesting. And with that, I'd like to wrap up this show so I can go out and do a little more traveling. If you have any comments on this or any show, send me an email at host@amateurtraveler.com, or find the many, many other ways of contacting me at amateurtraveler.com/contact. And as always, thanks so much for listening.
I got to see one more cathedral. I got to sit in one more cafe. I know that I